Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Susan LaPerla, the Director of Public Services at the Ferguson Library, and I'd like to welcome you to today's family program, the third in the series, Bringing History Alive, presented in memory of Harry Block, a longtime friend of the library who believed that learning the lessons taught to us by history was important for every American. This series is made possible by a generous gift from his loving sister, Louise Stern. Our first program taught us about the immigration experience of Jewish families who came through Ellis Island. The second was a musical journey through the African and African American roots of the American music canon. And today, our third will take you back to the civil rights movement and the work of one of its most seminal participants, Congressman John Lewis. Our special guest today is Andrew Aydin, co-author of the book Run, who worked beside Congressman Lewis in Washington for many years. And I also want to let you know that we're currently running, beginning today, a back-to-school book giveaway, and copies of Run will be available if you come into, right now they're in the main library, but I will be dropping them off at the other locations if you'd like to get a copy of Andrew's book. And also, we will have time for questions and answers at the end of the presentation, so please put your questions in the chat box and we can relay them to Andrew for you. And with that, I'd like to introduce you to Liz McKay, our Supervisor of Youth Services, who will introduce Andrew.
Susan. Hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome you on this beautiful Saturday afternoon to join us for this program this afternoon. I'm really looking forward to being able to introduce Andrew Aydin. He, as Susan mentioned, worked with Representative John Lewis. He's an Atlanta native. He served for more than 13 years on the staff of Congressman Lewis, predominantly serving as a digital director and policy advisor. In 2008, after learning that his boss had been inspired as a young man by the 1957 comic book Martin Luther King and the Montgomery Story, Aydin conceived the March trilogy and began collaborating with Representative Lewis to write it, while also composing a master's thesis on the history and impact of Martin Luther King and the Montgomery Story. Additionally, Aydin served as communications director and press secretary during Representative Lewis's 2008 and 2010 re-election campaigns, as district aide to Representative John Larson, a Democrat from Connecticut, here in Connecticut, and as a special assistant to Connecticut Lieutenant Governor Kevin Sullivan. So we have some Connecticut roots. Today, Andrew continues to write comics and lecture about nonviolent civil disobedience and the history of comics and the civil rights movement. He's a graduate of the Lovett School in Atlanta, Trinity College in Hartford, and Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. And as Susan mentioned, he's a #1 New York Times bestselling author, a National Book Award winner, a Robert F. Kennedy Book Award honoree, a Prince Award winner, a Seibert Medal winner, a Walter Dean Myers Award winner, a 2-time Eisner Award winner, and the recipient of multiple Coretta Scott King honors. And that's not even the full list of all of his literary awards. I'm very pleased to be able to present to you today, Andrew Aydin.
Thank you so much, Liz. It's great to be with everybody. My name is Andrew Aydin, and as you said, I started out in Connecticut when I went to college, and but it really all started for me back in Georgia, where I grew up. My father was a Turkish Muslim immigrant who left when I was very young, and I was raised by a single mother. And growing up that way, you have you kind of blame yourself. You wonder, why did my father leave? Was it my fault? And that's what led me into reading, and comic books in particular. My mother was always a reader. She was that lady, you know her at the library. There are many of you. She has a library card for every member of the family, and she's using each one to check out as many books as possible, to reserve as many books as possible. If she could have had a library card for the dog, she would have. That was my mother. And so in my house growing up, there were all these books. Mama used to keep this stack beside her bed, and it'd be 5, 10, 15 books deep. And she was always reading. And she would she would entice me with it. She would tell me about some of the drama or the violence or the action or some of the, when I got a little older, some of the salacious details. And I would spend my summers, because my mother didn't have a lot of time where I wasn't around. I would spend my summers with my grandmother up here where I am now in Western North Carolina near Asheville. And my grandmother didn't quite have as many books around, but what she did have was my uncle's comic books. And so she would give those to me to read, which, you know, as a now adult comic book fan, actually makes me cringe because, you know, I think the first X-Men comic I ever actually read was in fact an original printing of X-Men #1 that my uncle had. And the idea of handing those to a 9-year-old just kind of gives me a little bit of heart palpitations. But my grandmother didn't care. She wanted me to read. She wanted me to be entertained. And then she took me, I remember after I read a bunch of them and I'd read through just about everything that my uncle had collected. She took me, we were at a Piggly Wiggly, which is a grocery store out here in Western North Carolina. And she bought me a comic book. It was Uncanny X-Men 317. It had the lenticular cover. It was a Fatal Attraction series, if we've got any comic book fans in the audience. And I was hooked. I think part of what resonated so strongly with me was that these were stories about people trying to do the right thing simply because it was the right thing to do. The morality of it, the sense of justice. And I needed that. I needed male role models, you know. I needed to see that there was some sense of justice in the world, because the other thing was, you know, growing up in Atlanta in the 80s with a single mom, I witnessed firsthand all that she had to go through because she wasn't married, because she didn't have a husband to take care of things for her. And it wasn't just like a matter of splitting chores in the house. I can remember my mother not being able to get a loan. I can remember my mom trying to deal with things with the house and them saying, "Where's your husband, little lady? We're not going to talk to you about this." And it really instilled in me a sense of right and wrong that I carried into my politics. It showed me that I wanted to be a better man than those that I was seeing. And my mother encouraged this, not just the politics, but finding my voice in comics. I remember being 12 years old and going to Dragon Con for the first time. And I look back on it and I still can't believe my mother let me go by myself, but she sent me downtown Atlanta with one of those cell phones, you know, that was like a brick like this. And I remember seeing these creators for the first time, understanding that there are people behind these books, behind these comics. And I remember being so impressed at the idea that there were people who could make a living simply from the power of their ideas and what they could dream up. That seemed so free to me. That seemed like an almost unreal way to be able to live your life. So as I got a little bit older, I kept reading. I kept going to Dragon Con. I kept going to other conventions. And then I got a scholarship, actually. That's how I ended up at Trinity College in Hartford. They gave me a full ride. And so I showed up not understanding exactly how to dress. It's very warm in Georgia and it's very cold in Connecticut. So I remember my first snowstorm at school, and you know, I didn't have boots. I had a jacket, but I did not have what you would call a coat. And I remember putting on just layers and layers, trying to survive and thinking like, how do you people do this? But I kept going. I toughed it out. You know, you went to the old Habitat store or the Salvation Army, and you buy a men's coat and you buy some used boots, and you know, you keep going. But I brought with me that sense of right and wrong, and so I got very involved in student government. I was that nerd that was vice president of his student government his sophomore year of college. we led sit-ins to force the administration to keep the library open longer, because for those of us who were on scholarships, who were living on campus, they basically had you living in these Mendelean cells, right? They were about 8 feet wide and 12 to 14 feet long. And most of the room was taken up by a cabinet where you're supposed to put all your clothes and belongings. And so if you wanted to study, if you wanted to have some quiet time to work, you really had to go to the library, because just imagine dozens and dozens of those rooms all next to each other with all these hormonal teenagers running around doing what they do. And the rich kids had the housing off campus. Parents got them apartments and things like that, and those weren't available to us on scholarship. And so when they closed the libraries at 10 and 11 o'clock, we thought that was ridiculous because we had so much more work to do. So we wrote a letter. We followed the nonviolent process, not having ever met John Lewis up to that point, though he was my congressman since I was 3 years old. And we forced them to change that, and they kept it open. And I remember thinking how amazing it was to me that there was actually a way to use your youth and your passion to force change when others didn't necessarily see the necessity. And that had a big impression on me. So then I started interning for Kevin Sullivan, who became the lieutenant governor. And he really was a mentor for me in those early years. He took a liking to me. I think, we were two kind of chubby, dark-haired kids. And he gave me a chance, and he let me start on his staff after I graduated, working as a special assistant, sort of being his floor assistant when he needed me, and going to events and helping him with whatever I could. And I'll never forget my first day in the state capitol. It was the day after graduation. I never took a break. I graduated on a Sunday, and I started to work on a Monday. And my mother and my grandmother showed up because they hadn't gone home from graduation yet. And part of me always believed that they showed up because they wanted to make sure I was telling the truth, that I was really going to work in the state capitol, that I was really working for a lieutenant governor. I'll never forget them peering their heads into the office as I'm sitting there and totally mortified and embarrassed that there's my mother and my grandmother on my first day of work. And they said, "Oh, don't mind me. We're just looking around." And it's like, this is an office place. It's hard not to mind them. And they walked all the way into the lieutenant governor's office. And he looks up from some meeting and he says, "Can I help you?" And then they introduced themselves, and he was very kind. And then I took them to lunch. And that's where it really started for me in politics. I went to work for John Larson after. I handled veteran affairs. So that meant that I was doing casework. Casework is not glamorous. It's very difficult. And this was at the height of the Iraq War, when we were bringing back dozens and dozens of soldiers into Hartford every day, who had come from Iraq, who had come from Afghanistan. And we weren't prepared. We weren't able to bring back their medical records or preserve the necessary information so that when they came back to the United States, they were able to get the care that they'd been promised through the VA system. And to be very frank and candid with you, it took a huge emotional toll to look across the table at these veterans every day and not be able to help them in the way that I thought I should. And I did my best for as long as I could. But then my mother asked that I move back a little bit closer. I've been gone a long time. And so I applied for a job in the congressman's office. I thought maybe Washington, D.C. would be close enough. It's one day's drive from where she was living. She had moved out to Western North Carolina at this point. I'll never forget it. I remember getting the interview for that meeting, and I go in, and there's John Lewis sitting there. And we talk about Atlanta. We talk about people I hadn't gotten to talk about in years. People I grew up with. Maynard Jackson and his daughters. Andy Young, all these people that had been in my life as a young person in Atlanta. And I remember at the end of the interview, he said, "Is there anything you want to say?" I said, "Not really, sir. The only thing I would say is that, I'd worked for a number of politicians before, and every time my mother said, 'Oh, well, that's nice, but I've never really heard of them before.' And then I told my mother I was interviewing for a job with John Lewis. And my mother said, "Oh, that's great. He's a good one." And the congressman kind of got that half smirk that he would do, where he's like, and he turned and he said, "Well, why don't you go call your mom and tell her you got the job?" And that's where it started. That's how I started with Congressman Lewis. It was a difficult time back then for the congressman. He had a number of setbacks. I think the John Lewis that we celebrate today was not the John Lewis that I started working for. So I started answering his mail. And I remember being shocked at the backlog. His office had some challenges with management and things. And there was tens of thousands of letters. And it was my job to sift through them all and to make sure that everybody got a response. Because to the congressman, personally, each letter was very important. It is how he met Dr. King. It was how he became a part of the movement, by writing a letter and getting that response. So I got to work. I started to learn his voice. Learned a lot about him. And he took a liking to me. So that then about a year later, when he had a primary challenge, he asked me if I would come down and serve as his press secretary on the re-election campaign. And I was ecstatic. But I didn't understand exactly what the challenges were. I was in Washington, and it wasn't until I got down to Atlanta that I understood how much blowback he had received for his endorsement of Secretary Clinton. That he was targeted in a way that I think hurt him very deeply, because it questioned his very involvement in the movement, his commitment to the cause. And that was everything to John Lewis. And so on that campaign, the big question became, how do we tell people, how do we show people what John Lewis had accomplished in his life? How do we tell that whole story? And I was definitely the youngest person invited to be in those meetings. And as I heard so many ideas about essentially different variations of, we should do a documentary, I couldn't help think that that wasn't enough, that my generation needed more. And so we carried on, and I got to hear more stories that I'd never heard before, that weren't in books. As the congressman and I traveled around the district, as he gave speeches, as he talked to school children, I would hear these stories about SNCC and the role that the young people played in the civil rights movement, and the unbelievable power they were able to recognize through their organizing. I heard the stories of the sit-in movements and how in Nashville they were able to differentiate themselves and lead to essentially stronger reforms and a bigger movement than other places, because they were disciplined, because of their leadership, because of their community, and the sense of essentially their commitment. And I remember thinking, why had nobody told me these stories before? I grew up in Atlanta. John Lewis had been my congressman since I was 3 years old. And yet the version I always heard was about the March on Washington and Selma. That was it. Those were the versions they told me. I didn't understand that the March on Washington couldn't have been possible without the Freedom Rides, because you couldn't have brought that many people of color to Washington on segregated buses. You needed the buses to be integrated to stage such a large action. And I didn't understand how the Freedom Summer and the challenge of the Democratic Convention in 1964 set the stage for Selma to be possible, that it elevated the issue of civil rights, and in particular voting rights, to the national stage, so that it forced LBJ to act when Selma happened. So I remember hearing all these stories and just being amazed and just coming to love this man even more than I already had. And then when the campaign was almost over, we started talking about what we were going to do after. It's one of those late nights, you're tired, you're sweaty, you've been out all day, you got a little bit of sunburn. And some folks were saying, I'm going to go to the beach. I'm going to go see my parents. And I said I was going to Dragon Con again. And everybody laughed at me. All these stuffed shirts and well-heeled political operatives. They just kind of went, oh, well, there goes that nerd again. Except for one person. I heard a deep voice from the back of the room say, don't laugh. There was a comic book during the movement, and it was deeply influential. And that comic book was Martin Luther King and the Montgomery Story. This comic book right here. Sold for 10 cents. It was 16 pages cover to cover. It was done in a beautiful studio house style from the 1950s. And I remember going home that night and looking it up on the internet and just being amazed at how well done it was. I mean, it was this introduction to Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King and Gandhi and nonviolent civil disobedience. I remember sitting there thinking, well, why isn't there a John Lewis comic book? And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that could be the solution to our problems, or at least a big part of it. So I went back to work the next day. We had one of those meetings. We talked yet again about documentaries. And then I raised my hand and I said, what about a comic book? And again, as much the same reaction. I got laughed at. Even the congressman thought it was a little bit preposterous. I think at one point he said he thought I'd lost my mind. But I couldn't give up the idea because it made so much sense to me. This generation, my generation, we grew up on the internet. Our language is sequential narrative. What is a tweet or a meme or a post but sequential narrative? It is words and pictures working together to tell a greater truth, to convey information in an efficient and immediately recognizable way. And so I kept asking. It bothered some of the other staff. They didn't understand why I was being so persistent. But I think a congressman went home and talked to his wife about it. And his wife, Lillian, was a librarian. She loved books. And so one day we were campaigning just at the very end of the campaign, just before Election Day. We were over off Wallace Road, which is near where the congressman used to live. We're hammering in yard signs. All of a sudden, there was a flash of lightning. I remember the congressman looking up and kind of looking around. And then we heard the thunder roll. And all of a sudden, John Lewis took off like a light, 68 years of age, just full sprint back to the car. We realized that he had left us behind, and so we took off to follow him. And we all dive into the car, and you're hearing the patter, 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 patter on the roof. One of the interns says, ask him again. Can't go anywhere now. So we started talking about it. And then the congressman turned and he got that little half grin on his face. And he said, okay, I'll do it, but only if you write it with me. And that moment changed my life. I'd never written a comic book before. I didn't know what I was doing. I'd read them, but I'd never had the opportunity or the impetus to try and actually put a script together, much less for someone like John Lewis. And so we spent the next 2.5 years trying to figure out, could we find someone to publish it? Was anyone interested? Could I do it? I ended up writing what became March Book 1 entirely on spec, just to prove that this could work as a comic book. And most of publishing said no. All these fancy New York publishing houses that you think of that ushered in these great works, they said no. So we found a teeny tiny publisher of 4 people that I pitched over the table at a comic book convention. They introduced us to Nate Powell. And that's how this process began. We didn't know if it would work. I think some people believe that that was our only goal, was just to tell people about John Lewis. But one of the things I did at the same time is I started working on my master's thesis at Georgetown. And, you know, it seemed perfectly reasonable. I was going to work full time on the Hill. I was going to write a series of graphic novels, and I would get a master's degree. No need for a personal life. And when it came time to write my thesis, they asked, you know, they give you this talk about like, well, you're going to have to spend a lot of time with this. What do you really want to know more about? And I said I wanted to know more about Martin Luther King and the Montgomery story. I wanted to know how it was made, who made it, how it was used. They thought I was a little nuts, but they agreed. I had a wonderful thesis advisor. She was an economist at the World Bank, and she was Japanese. So she understood the power of comics. It was part of her culture. So I set out trying to figure out exactly how they used Martin Luther King and the Montgomery story. And we found several things. First, we found out that Dr. King himself actually helped edit it, which just kind of blew my mind, right? Like, that's not the Dr. King you think of. Like, nobody says Martin Luther King Jr., comic book editor. And yet there we were. We had the letters. We had the information. We had his words offering his guidance on the script. And what's funny is it was just sitting in an archive available online at Stanford, but nobody had put two and two together about what he was talking about. And then we found, because I was fortunate enough to have Jim Larson, the congressman's mentor from Nashville, helping me with my thesis, and who had used the comic book in some of the earliest workshops he led before he even went to Nashville, when he was working as a field secretary for the Fellowship of Reconciliation. He told me that he had led workshops in the Midwest as early as 1958. And that they had been given the comic book, and that the students on their own after these workshops went and led sit-ins, actually understood the philosophy. And that all of this came about because they were on something called a reconciliation tour. Essentially, Jim Larson and his colleagues had gone all throughout the South and the Midwest, and wherever they would be had, to schools and libraries and church basements, giving nonviolence workshops and giving the comic book to anyone who would listen and who would take it with them and spread the gospel. And so as I put all this together into my thesis, and I was telling the congressman all about it. It's funny, you can actually go back and look. There's a 2012 clip as I had just finished my thesis and turned it in. We were on the way to finishing March, and this comic had been translated into Arabic and used in the Middle East. It was part of the Arab Spring. It was used in Tahrir Square. The congressman goes on, he excitedly talks about it with Andrea Mitchell, and he gets a few of the facts wrong about the print run and all that sort of stuff. But you could see how it was clicking in his mind what we were doing, that this wasn't just about telling a story anymore, that this wasn't about inspiring a new nonviolent revolution, that we had to tell each of these chapters and leave all of these lessons behind so that there would be a handbook, a guidebook for young activists coming up to understand their power, to understand how another generation had done it, so that they would be able to take the reins and lead when John Lewis was no longer able. And so as publication drew near, we didn't know if it would work. We guest edited an issue of a newspaper magazine called Creative Loafing. It's like a weekly paper in Atlanta. And it was on the future of nonviolence. And my thesis was the feature article, and we commissioned all these articles from local organizers and activists because we were trying to show how social media could be used to further protests. And then we wrote this note, because if you understand the philosophy and discipline of nonviolence, you know that you have to write out your objectives before you begin. You have to clearly state what it is you're trying to do. That is one of the tenets. And so we did. And we said we were trying to ignite a new nonviolent revolution in America, to teach this generation about their power, and to teach this generation how another generation did it so that they can do it, and they can do it better. We didn't know if it was going to work, but the first inkling we had that we were onto something rather substantial Came just before book one was released. About a week, I got a phone call from a reporter at the Wall Street Journal. Nice guy. I've gotten to be really good friends with him since. This is the first time I'd ever heard from him. And he said, look, I'm calling because I wanted you to know that I read your book and I loved it. But I thought you'd be interested in knowing that my 9-year-old son read it. And now he's gone and put on his Sunday suit and he's marching around my house demanding equality for everyone. And that was it. The idea that we could instill a social consciousness in every 9-year-old in America. That was it was like a lightning bolt moment for us, that it was working. But before the book had even been released, putting this book in the hands of a 9-year-old could engender such a response. And we knew we were on the right path. So then we set out to essentially replicate what it was that Jim Lawson had done. We led our own reconciliation tour for years with each book and even beyond. We went to schools and libraries. Matter of fact, I went to Stanford and visited y'all. We went all over the country. We did hundreds of events together and apart, giving talks and making sure that all the young people we could find got copies of our books. And I can't tell you how much it meant to me to see John Lewis looking down on Black Lives Matter Plaza in Washington a little over a year ago and see Black Lives Matter written out on the street, just as it was done with March on the cover of March Book 3. And seeing a generation that had now grown up with March in their classrooms, using the lessons to continue John Lewis's fight, to pick up the baton, to continue dramatizing the conflict. And I know it gave him great joy when we talked about it. But at the same time, over those years, it became apparent that too many people thought of Selma as an end and not a beginning. That they had this false understanding of Selma as an event that fixed so many problems instead of a high point on a long road. People did not understand that the pushback to the Voting Rights Act, that the attempts to undermine and weaken its protections began immediately after its signing. And they didn't understand that John Lewis continued to have to fight this fight, not just for the protections of the Voting Rights Act, but some of the most basic protections of the Civil Rights Act, which is more than a year old. Churches in southern Georgia still had not integrated. And so 2 days after the signing of the Voting Rights Act, John Lewis went to Americus, Georgia, had a protest in front of the church, was arrested and taken to jail. And then that night, 2 days after President Johnson had handed John Lewis a pen that he used to sign the Voting Rights Act, the Klan, led by their Grand Dragon, Calvin Craig, led their largest hooded march in decades. What he said in that march struck me more than anything else. He urged his followers to be peaceful, to not hoot and holler, to not call out, to essentially be nonviolent. And they led a march through downtown Americus, just as the civil rights movement had, except the sky was covered with their pointed hoods and their vitriolic message. And that's where we begin in Run. I never thought Run could be so important, but time has shown us that these are the lessons we have to learn now. We have to understand that the forces that we see in our country right now, working to suppress the ability of every person to register and vote, are the same forces that began on August 7th, 1965, pushing back against the Voting Rights Act, trying to weaken it, trying to eliminate its protections. And then we look at what happened with Julian, the congressman's best friend. He spoke out against the war, and they tried to take away his seat in the Georgia General Assembly. We look at his other friend, Sammy Young, who was murdered for trying to use a white bathroom. Or Jonathan Daniels, who was murdered by a sheriff's deputy after a protest in a setup that the police were complicit in. And we look at John Lewis's push and his persistence to keep SNCC integrated, to push back against those who had seen so much violence that they believed that there was no possible way for white people and Black people to live together. And that insistence on an integrated SNCC, on the protections of the multiracial democracy, on the true ideals of the beloved community that John Lewis had fought so hard for with Dr. King. It cost him his chairmanship. And then when his colleagues in SNCC began behaving in ways that he did not find moral or ethical, trying to undermine Dr. King, trying to sabotage his efforts, John Lewis again showed the moral courage and resigned in protest. But I think in my own life, this book showed me a lot more than just the politics. A little over 4 years ago, my mother passed away. And as most of you know, a little over a year ago, the congressman passed away. And the loss that John Lewis experienced in this book, it stayed with me. And it helped me understand that I'll get through this period, that I can survive this. I remember showing him some of those last pages and hearing in his voice how excited he was to see himself, to see this story told. Because we all want to imagine John Lewis the hero. We forget how many times he had to pick himself back up. We forget about the losses. We forget about the body blows that didn't come on camera or on a courthouse steps. We forget about the betrayals. We forget about how he suffered and then reinvented himself into something new. And that's what Run is about. Run is about how John Lewis came from being an activist and went on to become a public servant. In many ways, it's a call to action for all of us. For those of us who've marched and protested, been in the streets over the last decade, we have a new mission. John Lewis gave us our marching orders. It's time for us to run. Just like those in Lowndes County in 1965 and 1966 did not face a choice of people who looked like them being on the ballot. They faced the choice of choosing between two different segregationists of varying degrees. All too often, that is the same choice we face on our ballots today. And it's not just about federal office. It's not just about Congress. This is happening at the local level. This is about school boards and town councils, city councils, and board of eds. This is our time. John Lewis cannot lead us anymore, but he can be our example. And so that's why I'm out here, as a congressman would say, spreading the good word, speaking up and speaking out, and trying to inspire a few more people to join us. Because you marched with us. And now it's time for you to run. So thank you all for listening. I know it's a beautiful Saturday afternoon there in Connecticut. I'm sorry I can't be with you, but the world is shut down, and I hope we can do this in person sometime again when the world opens up. So I think we're going to take a few questions, and I think Liz, you're going to handle that, or just let me know the best way to do that, or if we can read them from the chat, whatever works best for everybody. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you. That was that was just so moving and inspiring. I did have a question. How do you think the congressman would feel, or how would he act publicly in response to the violence at the Capitol last January? What would he have made of that? How would he have been integrated into those events into his philosophy, and where to go from there?
There are days when I am grateful that the congressman did not see those events, because I know it would have broken his heart. They smeared feces in our old office. They violated this place that was in a certain way sacred to the congressman. I know he would have been angry. He would have been upset. And I know he would have walked away from it saying, we need to get to work. And those very same people are out there right now running for school boards, running for town councils, running for city councils. And I think that's what makes this book and its message so important right now, because these are the same forces linked by time and a philosophy. And the only way that we can fight them is if we do it by sticking to the process and to the system. You know, there was that old saying, a phrase that Dr. King would quote: violence begets violence in a vicious spiral into darkness. If they are going to be mobs and chaos, we must be orderly and disciplined. And more than anything else, I hope it shocked people into understanding why we need them to participate in the democratic process. Oh, is there a question?
I have a question. This is about sort of the process of writing. Can you talk a little bit about how the co-authoring with John Lewis happened?
Yeah, you know, John Lewis and I had our own way of doing things because we'd worked together in so many different capacities over the years, right? So I was his digital director. So if you've ever heard of Good Trouble, I'm sorry, that's my fault.
Love
That
this.
was, we turned it into a hashtag, and that's where it sort of took off from. And just like starting in his office, writing his mail, right? You build this connection with someone where you understand their voice, you understand their stories. He used to tease me because I'd bring stuff to him and he'd say, boy, you know more about me than any other human being on this planet. And I think when we work on this, you know, there's several phases. There's the interview phase, right? Because so much of this is based on his oral storytelling, right? That's the narration. And then there's the phase of bringing him primary documents, essentially, and saying, Congressman, do you remember this? And then trying to sort out, like, you know, do you know where so-and-so was standing? Where did they come from? Do you remember exactly what they said? No? Do you know where I might be able to find that? Like that sort of stuff, right? And then there's this other phase, which was always a challenge for all of us, where we would show him the art and he'd be like, that doesn't look like that, you know? And so it was just a constant dialogue. But I think, you know, what lets us be able to do this is that we work together for so long on so many different projects in so many different ways, right? I mean, like, I remember producing him on an episode of Arthur, and he was trying to do this voiceover work, right? And he's like, doesn't understand. I'm like, just read it like you would be normally. And he'd be like, hello, Arthur. And you're like, dude, no. Like, you gotta like bring it down a notch, right? You'd be like, hello, Arthur. You'd be like, no. Like you're normally doing it, right? And it was stuff like that where, like, you know, he would say I'm like a son to him. And I think that sort of closeness, right? I mean, whether it's like, you know, helping him put his suit on before an event. I mean, there's just, we got to know each other in a way that most staff never do. I think it got put to me in another way when the congressman son said that like there was the staff and then there was the people that were like family, and I'd crossed over into that space. Well, it was different for each book. With this one it was certainly more difficult, especially showing him the art, uh, but we collaborated on so much that it was uh, pretty effortless.
It's really wonderful to see the love in your face when you speak about him. I mean, you actually glow when you talk about him. I was curious, are you still involved in the congressional district anymore? Do you have a role? Has his successor embraced the work that John Lewis was doing and trying to accomplish?
So I've turned down a number of jobs in Congress. I don't want to go back right now. I mean, the truth is, I lost my mother, my grandmother, and the congressman over the last 4 years. And I need a little space. I need to step away. I think Congress can be a very toxic place. John Lewis was a great man, but the staff was not. And this is far healthier for me right now. I'm being out of my mother's farm, working the land, writing. I am participating in the district. I probably talk to a member of Congress 2 or 3 times a week, just with whatever they want to talk about. So I'm happy to be a resource for a number of people. But I think right now, and I'm an artist in residence at Georgia State. So I go down there and I help give workshops. My mother went to Georgia State at night. And then my grandmother never went to college, but she worked there as a secretary. So I go down to Atlanta every so often and do these things virtually and just try to help because, Georgia State graduates more students of color than anywhere else. And this is a program called the Creative Media Industries Institute. So it's about teaching people how to tell their stories. And so if you want to teach people of color how to tell their story, that's where you need to be. But I think every time I've entertained the notion, I get this like pit of dread in my stomach, and I just don't think I could ever be staff again. Maybe I'll run one day, but how do you staff someone after you've staffed John Lewis?
Sure, it's difficult. Now, this is book 1 of Run. Are you planning another trilogy?
Well, the congressman and I had written 2 manuscripts, and in the back of my mind, I always had a 3rd book about the Julian Bond John Lewis campaign in '86. But whether or not I do any more books after this, I don't know yet. I think there's a lot of questions that still need to be answered among whether or not it's the right thing to do, how we do it. And so, as a congressman would say, we between me and the other artists and the congressman's son, John Miles, we all need to come to what he would call a Quaker consensus, so that we all agree and we move forward together. And so I honestly, I don't know. I may never pick up another John Lewis book again. There's so much it's been strange to watch what happened after he died, and everybody has a John Lewis story. And so many people want to seem like they were close to him now. And oftentimes it's people who weren't very good to him while he was alive. And that's something that I try very hard not to be a part of. And I've noticed a lot of that happening, and it's definitely hard to see. So much of the congressman and I's relationship was in public, right? I mean, you go look at the National Book Awards, the National Book Festival speech in 2016, and he's up there saying, Andrew's become like a son to me, right? And so I don't ever feel like an insecurity in what our relationship was and how strong it was. But I definitely feel in doing these books and putting them out, there are people who don't want this chapter told, right? Because the things that he told me, the stories, the experiences that he had, they don't make everybody look so great, right? Like, it's not a good look to be like, yeah, I was undermining Dr. King in 1966, right? Like, people don't want that story told, and their children are out there on CNN still talking, and I don't know that I really feel like it's my place to fight that battle on his behalf. So I just have to wait and see, and heal above all else.
There's one comment in the chat from one of our guests, and she says, I just want to say that I appreciate this conversation. Mostly, I'm learning more than his political position. More of the personal allows me to see that he was broken. Thank you so much. I don't know if you have a comment to that. Or response.
Yeah, no, that's we're all broken, aren't we? Right? And I think that's one of the things that's hard to watch is, it's like what Reverend Warnock said about Dr. King at a Martin Luther King Day service a few years ago. He said, the Dr. King we celebrate today is not the Dr. King that was assassinated in 1968. And I think I worry that there is going to be sort of a Disneyfication of John Lewis, right? The Netflix miniseries version of him. And we take out what actually made him extraordinary and make him inaccessible to young people who could see him as a role model or who could see a pathway in their life that bears similarities to John Lewis's. And I think, whether it's in Run and you see that reinvention of himself going from activist to public servant, or in our own experience where you see his reinvention of himself going from trying to be a member of Democratic leadership to being a bit of an agitator and using Good Trouble and social media and his graphic novels to spread his message in a whole different way that Congress arguably would have never considered unless he had led that way. This is something he did over and over in his life, and I think it's something we all do, right? I mean, I started off as a rabble-rousing young activist. I end up as a senior political aide on the Hill, and now I'm writing Batman, and I think and I'm farming. Like, this is my own reinvention in my life. And I think in some ways it's so helpful for us to be able to see stories of someone like John Lewis reinventing themselves, because we need to understand that this is a natural path of life, that we are not stagnant people, that life is not stagnant, that we're always changing and evolving. And those things that break us do heal, and they heal in such a way that it leads us to a new path. And that's the same whether it's John Lewis or any one of you. Oh, is the book autographed? I did book plates for you guys, right?
Yes, you did book plates.
Okay. They're in the mail, I think. You should get them any day.
They're in the mail.
Yeah.
They're on the way back to the library. So thank you so much. And we have enough for all the copies of the books that we
fantastic.
purchased to give away. So I expect to have them Monday or Tuesday. So
that's awesome.
For the people who want to come in and grab one of the books, just wait till midweek if you would like to have the autographed copy. So, and it has today's date and the name of the lecture, and it's a way to commemorate the day, which is wonderful. And I do want to say that what you just said, that's especially important for right now, because I think right now people feel that they may not be making any progress, or there isn't a lot of change in their life, but to be hopeful that something good can still come. I think we need to live with that idea.
And the loss. All of us are experiencing a loss
Yep.
right now, whether it's the loss of the life we thought we'd have, or a loved one or a friend.
That's so true.
Yeah.
So true. Well, I think that wraps up the questions, Liz, unless you had any last thoughts before we go.
I had one last question. This is just myself being a children's librarian, I think. So you mentioned originally that you'd never before March, you'd never written a comic book before. And now I saw on your website, you've got a few under your belt. You mentioned just now you're writing Batman, and you've written Captain America, I think. And
yeah. If you want to be nerdy about this, this is my shelfie. This is how much I've written now.
Ooh,
so it's like a full hand length wide, right? Like that's how they measure horses, right? So I guess that's how we measure authors.
Sure.
Yeah.
So it's fun. One question that I get And I have my answer to this, but what do you say to parents who question the validity of comic books as what their kids should be reading? I mean,
I mean, the unapologetic answer is simply to say you're wrong. But the generous answer, I think, is this generation is growing up in ways that you did not, that they have a different literacy. And I will be the first person to concede that comics has not yet fully explored the full potential of the medium. But right now we're living in a golden age. And the United States is one of the last major developed countries in the world to accept sequential narrative, whether you call it manga or comics or the think of 1010 and the role that plays in French or Belgian or European society, right? It's up to folks like me and my colleagues to make better comics, to make better graphic novels. And I think March being the first graphic novel to win the National Book Award, it was in a sense literature acknowledging that this is changing. And, we don't judge prose just because 50 Shades of Grey outsold everybody else. Like, yeah, Superman is just going to outsell John Lewis. It's the reality. But it doesn't mean it will be that way forever. And I think the fun thing right now, particularly as a parent with children who are entering into the graphic novel space and reading these books for the first time, is that you actually have an opportunity to have them meet creators who 50 years from now, they will tell their kids they knew, because they will be looked at in ways that you can't even imagine yet. This is a special moment in history in terms of the printed word. This is the birth of a new medium for communication on a global scale. And the internet made it possible, but physically holding a book in your hands, being able to have that same experience, it doesn't take away from the written word. It is simply another way of exploring it. I read a lot of books as a kid, but I also read a lot of comics. In many ways, they complement each other. And being able to have the brain that develops with multiple literacies is actually an incredibly important skill to be prepared to go out into the workforce or to learn things more quickly. This is just an advanced form of understanding. And I think any parent who comes into this with this attitude, I say read March, start there. And if you can walk away from that book and say you knew everything in there and you could have learned it in a faster way, well, first I'd say you're crazy and you're probably lying. But second, I would say that this is an opportunity. We all grow, we all change. I'll tell you my own life, right? The way I changed. My mother loved to work in the yard every Saturday. And you do that in Georgia in the summer, it is hot and there are mosquitoes and it sucks. And I thought when I grew up, I was never going to mow another lawn again. And then my mother died and I took over her farm. And the way in which I find solace, honestly, and process some of the hardest decisions that I have to make is by going out there and mowing for hours and hours. We're not always the same person, just as we talked about the reinvention of ourselves and we just talked about how we change over time. Comics particularly are well suited for a young mind, and they will help them learn more quickly. They will help them develop a greater literacy, but it does not take anything away from what else they might read. If anything, it will accentuate and embellish it. So I hope that old notion will go away very quickly, because there are a lot of books written about the civil rights movement, but it wasn't until March came out that these young people all knew who John Lewis was. And imagine how much more they could know if you allow them to explore the full breadth and depth of the graphic novel canon.
I wish I could take exactly what you said and just put it on repeat for all the parents that we come in. Because that
I
was
think you
very
recorded
helpful.
this, so there you
Yes, we did. Yeah. That was very eloquent.
leave preachy Andrew on in the library. That'll be
Yes,
great.
we'll just keep you on a loop. And if you have time for one last question, in the chat, I think it's Deborah Stern maybe who wrote this. I can't read the person, but she says, I love the connection between the X-Men and how we need to be heroes in our day, and that there's an opportunity for extraordinary breakthroughs to overcome the apparent challenges. Are you inspired to write about addressing climate change, including with a justice lens?
I love that that's the question, because I'm actually already working on a book that is about environmental justice as racial justice, and trying to dramatize to people how industrialization has been taking this toll that now we're only seeing recently in many white communities. They've been taking this toll on communities of color for decades and generations. And I'm trying to address that through another graphic novel, to a graphic memoir essentially. And a very special person who I can't wait to introduce to everybody, but I can't tell you who they are until we sign a contract. We've got to have a publisher out in the world. She and I are already working on it, but you know how the process goes. But yeah, absolutely.
Great.
I mean, that's part of the reason I'm out at the farm in many ways, is because if my generation doesn't step up and understand sustainable farming practices, if we don't understand how to live, like I'm trying to get solar on the house, right? Mama built this house as a passive solar house, so we don't run up the same heating bills and things like that. We have to live a different life. Like, that much is sure. And it's funny because in many ways, just like you needed the freedom rides to have the March on Washington, you need March and Run to build that understanding in young people so that they can fight back effectively and address the challenges of climate change. Because the third rail, not to get preachy here, but just for a second, the third rail of all of this is when we start to talk about fighting wealth. And it's wealth that is creating the climate problem, right? It's 75% or something of the carbon emissions in the United States are put out by a very small number of companies, right? And when you go after that, when you start talking about wealth, Malcolm X, October 1964 in Nairobi, Kenya, says it should no longer be a movement based on race. It should be a movement based on poverty and the poor joining together all across the country, all across the world, to address what's happening and the inequality. They kill him 4 months later. Dr. King starts leading the Poor People's Campaign in Memphis, shot and killed. Bobby Kennedy runs on a platform of equality on financial terms, of fair housing, of equal opportunity education, of equal health care, all of these things, and they shoot and kill him. There is no coincidence that this is when people are murdered, because it is that dangerous. And so you need to teach this whole generation all of these skills and all of these lessons, so that then they can actually be able to bring enough pressure on our elected officials and then run and be better elected officials, frankly, so that we can actually address this issue. Because the people who are in power, the people who are comfortable, they're not going to do it unless you make them. Just like LBJ said to John Lewis, if you want voting rights legislation, you have to make me do it. We're going to have to make our politicians change, because right now we're addicted to fossil fuels still. We're not investing heavily enough in renewable energy, and we're emitting too much carbon that's destroying the atmosphere. So there is a huge shift that has to happen, not just in our culture, but in our laws. It's great that you're recycling, but that's not where the problem lies. It's in all these other places, and it's going to take institutional reform. Sorry, that was a little preachy.
No, that's good.
Not at all.
So people have been asking how they can get in touch with you, and you have a contact link on your website.
Mhm.
Is that the best place for us to keep up to date on your work and the progress that you're making on your different projects? Or
Yeah, I mean, I post a lot on social media. You can see about the snake that is living in my basement where I am right now, that I'm just glad hasn't popped up.
Is that on Twitter or Instagram?
Yeah, that's Twitter, but Instagram as well. I use
Okay.
both. Eventually I'm going to start a newsletter. It's just right now I'm a very small operation. It's me and Griffin. So it's I'm just pivoting. I mean, I spent the last 6 months just cleaning out the house,
I
and now
know.
it's getting the book out, and so I'm going to be doing better. But yeah, definitely stay in touch through the website. If you want to follow my work, follow me on social media. And there's contact information on there as well for like speaking people and literary agents and all that other sort of stuff that
That's
kind of
great.
comes with this. So yeah, no,
Good.
first of all, hey, thank you so much for having me. I don't know if I said this strongly enough at the beginning, but Stanford was one of the first places, or the Ferguson Library in Stanford was one of the first places to invite me to speak on my own after March Book One came out. And it was so sweet. And it meant so much to be able to come up and visit and come back to Connecticut. I hope I get to do it again soon.
Oh, I hope so. It was so great to have you here, even via Zoom. It was really it was a wonderful program. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. All right. Well, y'all
Best
stay
of
in
luck
touch.
on all the projects.
Yes,
Appreciate you.
we
And
can't
I
wait
hope
to
the
see what's
crops
coming.
come in for you.
Yeah, me too. The squash bugs got my pumpkins.
Oh,
Oh, no.
I know.
Well,
Next
you
year.
better
I'm
go
getting
out and
better.
get the apples.
Yeah, I'm learning though. Give me a few years.
Okay, that's great.
All
Thank
right.
you so
See
much.
y'all.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Liz. Bye.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye. And thank you everyone for coming.